To finish up our amazing panel, we have a representative from 350.org. 350.org has been at the forefront of some of the battles in relation to fossil fuel divestment and have been a very effective decentralised network running a number of different campaigns. And we're very pleased to have Moira Williams, who is the Queensland representative of 350.org under the leadership of Blair Police. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about fossil fuel divestment, councils, cities and governments.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. And yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'm going to keep this short and snappy because I think a lot of the points I was going to make have been made, which is great. So my name's Moira, I'm based here in Brisbane. I work with our volunteer group here in Brisbane. Robin and others in the room, Shanantha are here as well. We are a grassroots network, but we are a small team. We've got about 10 staff nationally, and about half of those staff work on divestment. So we have a couple of people supporting groups like Carly's Fossil-Free Universities, and we have a couple of people working on stopping new coal and gas projects. And for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been working on the campaign to stop Adani's Carmichael mine, which is set to look to ramp up again, unfortunately. But today I've been asked to touch briefly on particularly our focus on at the local level, cities, councils and governments. And I think that's interesting because at the start of this year we are 3 or 4 years into the divestment movement in the fossil fuel space. And at the start of this year we made a strategic decision to really focus on building the local council focus. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which I'll touch on. I think this quote already came up, but that basic statement around if it's wrong to wreck the environment, it's wrong to profit from that wreckage is a very simple statement. And so it's, of course, looking more broadly who's profiting from that wreckage. Super funds obviously are a huge one. We started to do some work looking at super funds and getting them to divest and found it particularly difficult. They're very immovable objects, but the banks also are a big one, and one that we have a lot of customers attached to and a lot of therefore access to. So since 2008, the big four banks have loaned almost $20 billion directly to fossil fuel projects, and no fossil fuel project has gotten off the ground without actual underwriting by an Australian bank. And we've seen that in key fights. We were heavily involved in the coal mine blockade at Maules Creek, and that was invested in by all 4 major banks. You might have remembered the fake press release that a friend of mine, Jonathan Moylan, wrote, saying that ANZ had pulled out of the Whitehaven coal mine. He almost went to jail for that action. But that was really the start of a shift of looking at finance campaigning around fossil fuel projects, and we're starting to use it more and more. And of course, I think Carol mentioned this, but a huge campaign here in Queensland to stop the industrialisation of the Queensland coast by the coal ports, and all 4 major banks have already invested in those. And if the Adani coal mine is going to get up, it's likely going to need the support of 1 or more domestic banks. So there's been a huge campaign targeted on those banks. To take a global picture, I think Carol touched on this, but there have been 500 institutions that have committed to divest worldwide, leading to divestment of over $3 trillion in assets. And Australia has the number one divestment, or greatest number of divestment announcements. And I think it is, I don't know why, I don't know if there's any analysis on this, but I think it is because Australians are sick and tired of calling on their governments to lead when we're failing to see such tragic response from our government. I think we got fossil fuel full award of the day at Marrakesh at the climate talks recently. So I think potentially that's why Australians have taken up divestment so quickly. But I sort of wanted to touch on divestment as a movement building tool. We are a movement-based organisation. We're led by a large network of volunteers, and I think these are some of the reasons why divestment has really spread as an idea and as a movement. And there's some of the things that Carly sort of touched on is that it is scalable. So it's a very simple idea, but it's scalable from your local church institution right up to a government institution. They all typically invest either have shares in these companies or they bank with banks that have fossil fuel investments. The campaign is replicable, so we've developed the campaign in a way that we can provide resources that allow groups to take those campaigns and run with them in their own communities, but it has a unifying message, that it's wrong to wreck the planet and it's wrong to profit from that wreckage. And I think Carly's also touched on those areas. It's more than just making a statement, it's actually meaningfully shifting money. And I think that has led over to the last 2 or 3 years is, that connection of coal with commodities or products like tobacco or gambling. So we're at the point, or we're starting to get to the point now where people really do equate coal in particular with those dreaded products like tobacco. In terms of governments, city councils, that sort of level, I think we've only had one government in Australia. It's the best government we have, the ACT government. They're leading the way. They're on track for 95 or 100% renewables by 2025, I think it is. And this guy's a bit of a legend, Andrew Barr, last year, I think, committed to the ACT government dumping fossil fuel investments, and that was off the back of a campaign by 350.org in Canberra, a local volunteer group, and the ACT Conservation Council. But it is the only government in Australia. In terms of cities and councils across the globe, there's 42 cities. There's some really iconic ones. Paris divested, I think, just ahead of the Paris climate talks, which was quite symbolic. Melbourne and Sydney, which I'll touch on in a sec. If you go onto our website, you can have a look at these numbers are tracking all the day, or are kept up to date. But is that 6 million or 6 billion? How many zeros is that? 6.8 billion. Whew, okay, that's quite a lot of investments held by divested councils. And so here in Australia, we've had about 28 local councils divest. And it's interesting to think about, that's about 2.5 million Australians, or 10% of Australians really that are living in council areas where their local council has divested. And there's been a really interesting model. In some areas, we've provided a lot of support for those campaigns, and in others, it's really been the leadership of local councillors that have taken up the campaign and really run with it. So this is a picture of our fossil-free 350.org group in Sydney, and really it was a 2-year campaign of literally 6 to 8 people, 6 to 8 volunteers that ran that campaign over 2 years, and eventually this year got the local council to divest. So it was a fantastic effort, and we had Clover Moore off the back of an election state publicly that this was a significant show of climate leadership. And so when we talk about council divestment, it is really about creating those wins and momentum, and also large, big public statements. It's no good having divestment that happens in the back corner or behind closed doors. This really is about forcing the issue out into the public, into the media. Here locally, we have run a campaign against Brisbane City Council. Brisbane's actually almost like a state government, really. It's so big and so massive. I was shocked at how much councillors earn. But I think we ran a campaign and successfully, before the last local election, got both the Greens and the ALP to commit to divest, and showed with polling in the lead up to that the majority of Brisbane residents here do want the council to divest. So they don't want their ratepayers' money going to funding climate chaos. Unfortunately, we've hit a bit of a brick wall with an LNP, very heavily dominated LNP council here, but keen to hear ways of how we can shift them and make the largest Australian council divest from fossil fuels. I think the other interesting space is where in communities where coal or fossil fuels has been a big part of that community. So last year we saw, it says here, Newcastle, home of coal. It's the home to the world's largest coal port in Australia, of Newcastle divest. And I think the symbolism then of that decision did actually kick off quite a wave of debate and controversy, and there was a point where that council actually had to go back and vote again. The backlash was so strong. So I think these areas where there are communities that either built on the mining industry or are facing active projects, like we saw the Gloucester Council divest right in the middle of the campaign to stop fracking in that community. I think that can be a really powerful statement, because we have this issue where state governments are making decisions about the resources in those communities and local governments have no power. So this decision to divest is politically really powerful. I think, the banks are changing. All 4 banks now have made, and I should have said, when we look at council divestment, generally councils don't have shares, so it is actually a matter of just shifting their investments away to fossil-free banks, so away from the big 4, which is actually quite a simple process. And I think we are starting to see the banks changing. All 4 have made commitments to 2 degrees of warming, and we need to hold them to account on that, because they are actively still funding fossil fuels, and there's groups like Market Forces and ourselves that are working on shifting that. But we have seen 450 million divested personally here in Australia, and the Bank of America, which used to fund or to be the biggest funder of coal in Australia, funded the devastating removal of over 500 mountains in the Appalachian region, which I spent some time in. Actually, there was a long-standing campaign to get Bank of America to divest, and they've finally done that, which is fantastic. So I think we are starting to see them shift, and increasingly we'll see a campaign to hold the big 4 banks here in Australia accountable to their investment decisions to keep us to 2 degrees. I think I'm going to stop there and hopefully find time for some questions. Definitely join 350.org. I think if what Carly can show and what fossilfree.org Sydney and others shows, that it is, a small group of people can really make a huge difference. There's different ways to go. The QUT campaign was very much an external public-facing campaign. Fossil Free Sydney spent 2 years inside track meeting with people that, I think it was even Tony Abbott's sister or cousin was on the board of that then eventually came over to our side and said, yes, this is morally the right thing to do. So certainly join up. We've got a volunteer group here in Brisbane and across the country. That website's a really good one, particularly for councils. It's got a great video on there just mapping out all the councillors that have divested, or interviews with councillors from councils that have divested. But other than that, thanks for your time.